Thank you very much. I'm going to just bring in Martin now. Martin, are there some questions in the chat that we can bring in?
Yeah, absolutely. I thought the point that was made kind of right near the start, but actually ties in very well with what you were talking about. So I think both of you, and particularly Michael, would probably agree that the war on drugs was a failure, and therefore you'd probably be, I don't want to state your position for you, but would probably be in favour of decriminalisation. In fact, Leah said in the chat that she's from Portugal and all drugs have been decriminalised in Portugal for, I think, over a decade now.
Yes.
But then Addy says, so obviously you were talking specifically there about the sort of licensing of psychedelics for medical use and whatever, but more generally just for, cannabis, heroin, MDMA, whatever it is, if you think it's probably on balance a better option to make them decriminalized rather than criminalized, how would you then make their use safer for a wider public? And do you think a similar restrictions that we have on alcohol would be appropriate, or do you think there should be other measures put in place, or do you think it should be done on a kind of drug by drug basis? I just wonder what your thoughts were.
I think that's the key point, Martin, that these drugs are more dissimilar than similar. They're unified by being illegal. and that in a way is the least interesting thing about them. The proper cultural container for heroin or cocaine is going to be very different than the proper container for psychedelics, and we're going to have to figure out each one. And I don't know the answer. We have to deal with the fact that some of these drugs are addictive. They don't addict everyone. Some people are more prone to it than others for various reasons. One of the really interesting things about addiction is that it's not universal, that it's not a property it's merely of the chemicals. Johann Hari has written, brilliantly about this, and you really have to look at the circumstances of someone's life, or whether they had trauma, or look at the geography of the opioid epidemic in America. These are places where people's prospects are really dim. Where factories have closed, where there's no economic future in these places. And so heroin or other opiates become one of the few pleasures on offer, and a way to medicate yourself. Do you address the drug, or do you address the circumstance of these people's lives? Ideally, the latter. Psychedelics, we're proceeding down a couple paths at once. There's the medical path, where we perform drug trials and approve these drugs, and doctors can prescribe them, but they're valuable to other people too. So how are we going to make them available to people who are not clinically ill? Well, one model is the religious model. There are churches now being formed where psychedelics are used as a sacrament. We already have 2 ayahuasca churches that have the right to use ayahuasca in their sacrament. I think there are going to be a bunch of other churches, and that will be a place you can go to have psychedelic experience. I think the key when you're looking at all drugs, one of the reasons to look at indigenous populations and how they use drugs is that they've been at it for a very long time. In the case of psychedelics, we haven't. We've only had 50 years of experience with psychedelics, and they have a lot to teach us. And they teach us, there's some underlying principles that I think we have to bear in mind as we design these cultural containers for psychedelics and other drugs. One is there's always an elder present, someone who knows the territory, can guide people, can help people when they get into trouble. Another is the drugs are never used casually. For fun. They're used with a purpose. They're used, with a clear intention. That's important too. A third thing is they're used in a ritual way. There's always a pretty elaborate ritual around it, and I think that's really significant. This applies to all drugs. If you look at how the uneasy peace our culture has made with alcohol, and it's by no means perfect, and many people do suffer as a result of alcohol, and whether they're suffering themselves or because they're living with someone who's alcoholic, that people who use alcohol in a ritual way are not the people who get into trouble. That is to say, people who only drink after a certain hour and only drink with other people and drink with food our society has these kind of rules for alcohol consumption, and ritual is protective. And I think we should keep that in mind. What are the proper rituals to surround different drugs? So you can have legal regulation and you can have cultural regulation, and we probably need both. But I'm not an expert on some of these other substances, and it would be glib of me to pronounce how they should be handled. I just know the way we're handling it now is just a complete disaster, and surely we can do better.
So Alan had an interesting point where we're going back to caffeine. He says about caffeine boosting work commitment. So what might be the story of the recent rise of gourmet coffee? And I'm just in my head thinking that maybe Starbucks kind of came around in the 90s just as like financial deregulation was happening and the big bang in the city was happening, and then suddenly financial services became the dominant industry in the UK and in the US. And I'm wondering, can you see some kind of causation effects between the explosion of the likes of Starbucks and the sort of explosion of financial services?
It's a good question. I don't know. I mean, we live in a golden age for coffee. And coffee has gotten so much better than when I was young, where we drank this. It was a different species of coffee. Robusto was the kind of coffee most people drank. It was instant coffee. It was crappy diner coffee. It didn't cost very much. Now it's this very expensive everyday luxury. But we moved to Arabica coffee, which is much higher quality, and then we kind of elaborated it with espresso drinks, and I don't know exactly what drove that, but it's a happy development on the whole, except for the pretentiousness of some people around coffee and the expense. But while we're in a golden age of coffee, we should know that around the corner is a collapse. I hate to darken your day, but some of the research I did suggests that climate change is going to be devastating to coffee. That coffee is a very picky plant, and it needs a very precise altitude. It needs a very precise amount of rainfall and drainage. It grows in this band that circles the globe in the tropics. At high altitude, but there is a disease that is moving up the hills as climate change comes, and this is coffee rust, and it threatens. Estimates are that 50% of the lands now growing coffee will be unsuitable for coffee by 2050, and you can't go much higher up some of these mountains. So unless we can figure out a cure for coffee leaf rust, coffee will become quite precious. It'll be, it'll have the cost of it'll have the price of some of these other drugs. So that's a real concern. The future of coffee is really in doubt.
That's really interesting. That actually preempts a question by Fred O'Daly, who asks that about climate change. So you sort of mentioned coffee, but are any of these other psychedelic plants or psychoactive plants, should I say, under threat from climate change? And also, I think that leaves us with one of these, situations where you can imagine people in poor countries, growing these as cash crops rather than growing food for themselves, and the sort of imbalance that might cause to their economies.
Well, that's happening in a lot of places, growing opium as a cash crop instead of food. I mean, that's common in many places right now. Climate change is a threat, but also development is a threat. I mean, we're burning down the Amazon, and that's where a great many psychoactives that we've yet to even identify grow. There's ayahuasca, clearly, and there's a real threat to that through the deforestation in the Amazon. These are, jungle plants. But I think that it's an argument for conservation, and for also, there's a whole herbarium at Harvard of psychoactive plants that Richard Evans Schultes, the great ethnobotanist, discovered in his work. And a great many of them have never been chemically analyzed. And there's a project underway at Mass General to do just that. And we may find all sorts of other interesting psychoactives. The current menu is not the only menu or the complete menu. but we're racing development in the Amazon. So, I think that it's a conservation issue, just like peyote. I mean, it's a serious conservation issue. What climate change will do to peyote, hard to say. I don't think we know. They're really hardy plants that can survive great heat and long drought. But climate change may give us the opposite. I mean, it could be lots of rain in these areas. So anyway, it's a concern, but the most acute concern I would have to say is coffee and climate change.
We've had a few comments, a little bit more fun questions about what's going on in is it your office you're in there, or your sort of study? So someone's asking about the hat in the background. They're asking if that's a Paul Stamets hat.
This is yes. There's always somebody who recognizes it. Paul Stamets, the great mycologist, gives out these hats occasionally, and they're actually mushrooms. This is a polypore that grows on birch trees and is turned into felt. And it's incredibly light, and there's women in Transylvania apparently who make these hats, and I'm the proud owner of two of them. I also have some poppy heads there that I pointed out earlier. I think you can see them. I am growing opium poppies with a feeling of safety, but I have no intent to turn them into a narcotic. I'm growing them strictly for their beauty.
If anyone from the DEA is watching.
Yes.
So Barbara, sort of again developing my overarching theory of global capitalism and stimulants, says, would you say that caffeine served to develop the ego personality which was needed, presumably in the 80s and 90s, which were, in my mind, a very ego-driven, selfish kind of couple of decades, maybe a lot of cocaine as well, which another.
Well, I was going to say, I think that I think you can draw some interesting parallels between the decades of 80s and 90s and high finance and Wall Street, and cocaine, which was the drug of choice in that world. And it is ego fortifying. It makes people feel invincible, more likely to take risks. I'm sure there's a link between that drug but you don't know what comes first. Does the age, demand a certain kind of drug, or does the availability of that drug give you a different kind of age? And I don't know how to answer that question.
Well, Barbara then goes on to say, do you think that psychedelics are sort of needed right now to sort of awaken our kind of group consciousness and our kind of sense of community that maybe we lost in the...
Well, in the same way I didn't know what was going on in 1996, we don't know what's going on in 2021. We might be part of a shift in consciousness that psychedelics are sponsoring. And we might not be. I think it really depends on where we end up. There's a lot of hope that psychedelic experience will produce important changes in the consciousness of society, and that there is hope and some small evidence that people who have psychedelic experience become less egotistical, become less tolerant of authoritarianism, become more connected to nature. And there have been some small studies, including at Imperial College, on these questions. I question whether we should take them that seriously, because even though in individuals and anecdotally, psychedelic seems to push you in the direction of feeling a real kinship with nature and other people, and feel that love is more important than you ever realized. Most of the people having these experiences are probably inclined in that direction already. The real test will be giving psychedelics to like Trump supporters, and coal executives or Exxon executives, and does it produce changes in them? And I actually think we should do this research. I think it would be very interesting. And one of the things we do plan to do at the new Berkeley Center for the Science of Psychedelics that I'm involved with is look at before and after attitudes of a wide range of different kinds of people to psychedelic experience, and see if we can't get some of those conservatives to participate and see what happens. And if there are enduring changes, whether they are in these positive dimensions or not. Because one of the paradoxes of psychedelics is, even though they they are ego dissolving in the experience, there's a phenomenon of ego inflation that we witnessed in people like Timothy Leary, and who have this experience, become convinced they have the answer to all the problems that afflict us, and they become kind of unbearable. So anyway, as I said at the very beginning, the psychedelic experience is very constructed, and it's very dependent on set and setting, as Leary reminded us. So we have to do more research before we put LSD in the water supply.
I think that's something I think everyone could agree with. So there was a question from Daniel here about terpenes. Given that, so for those that don't know, terpenes are kind of the smell. I was going to say aromatic compounds, but then aromatic has a specific meaning in chemistry. So they're sort of smelly compounds that are found mostly associated in cannabis. Has a lot of different terpenes that give cannabis its distinctive smell, but I think they're contained in all kinds of different plants like pine and lavender and other things. But I just wondered,
and coffee and tea too, I believe, have terpenes.
And Daniel says, given the smell is such a strong sensation and likely guided early humans to select certain plants over other, I wonder if terpenes are something that humans are attracted to and wanted to ingest, much like psychoactive compounds. And I guess just to add to Daniel's question, could they also like have an effect psychoactively? So obviously by smelling different smells, that puts you in a different mood, and therefore maybe would affect the trip and the experience you have.
Well, we all have the experience of smelling certain herbs and spices and being transported by them. I mean, in subtle ways. Before the drug trade, there was the spice trade. And there's a wonderful book by a guy named Shivelbush called Tastes of Paradise. And he's looking at stimulants of all kinds. And he starts with like pepper and clove and gets to coffee and other things. But And a lot of the power, I mean, think of rosemary. I mean, the power of rosemary and smelling it and the memories that come back, that is consciousness changing. And I think that, and chili peppers, really hot chili peppers changes you. You feel different. You have this flush and your body temperature changes, but your mind changes too. And I think that's why some people like really hot food. So the line between food and drug is very subtle. And the aromatics in spices and herbs are definitely change our consciousness in subtle ways, and some of which we're barely aware of. But without question, whether it's always terpenes, I don't know. I don't know enough chemistry to say. But smell is a very important way we get these experiences. Also, it's important to know too that we really don't know everything going on, even in cannabis. That there's less research into cannabis than you might think. The government here makes it very difficult to study, and there's a lot of other cannabinoids. We've identified CBD and THC, but there's a bunch of other ones, and that's true too. There are alkaloids in San Pedro. I was interviewing a scientist yesterday that we don't know what they are, what they do, how they interact with mescaline. We just don't do a lot of this kind of chemistry. There's no money in it, basically. And so there's lots more to be learned about the chemical constituents of drugs we think we understand.
Fascinating. So we've probably got time for one or two more questions before Jules wraps up. So Phil Norton asked an interesting question, which says that you've spoken about uppers, downers, and outers, but he sort of raises the prospect of a fourth category of empathogens, or maybe togethers. Now, I'm thinking of a drug like MDMA, which makes everyone feel all kind of empathetic and in love with everyone. But are there actually natural plants that have a similar effect to that?
Well, mescaline has some of the quality of MDMA, and in fact, chemically, it's related. They're both phenethylamines, as opposed to tryptamines, the classic psychedelics like LSD and DMT and psilocybin are generally thought of as tryptamines. It's a different chemical skeleton or structure. And empathogen probably should be its own category, and MDMA is the great example. And there's a lot of research going on with MDMA. It's not classically thought of as a psychedelic, but if psychedelic simply means mind manifesting, it certainly qualifies. And it's probably the first of this whole class of drugs that will be approved. I mean, it's only like 2 years away from approval, it appears. And there's been research recently published, phase 3 drug trials suggesting that it is very effective to treat trauma. And the reason that appears to be the case is it kind of downregulates or turns off your amygdala and the fight or flight response, allowing you to deal with difficult memories without getting as upset as you normally would. So, and it's been very useful when it was still legal in therapy. There were thousands of therapists using MDMA in talk therapy because of the bond it created between the therapist and the patient. So, yeah, I guess I should have done an empathogen, the 4th chapter. Well, someday.
So I'll just leave you with one question before we go back to Jules for his final comments. So Alexander's kind of interested in what's your next psychedelic project? So I think it's probably the work you're doing at Berkeley, correct?
Well, it's not a writing project, but yeah, I am very interested in helping the research. And so we've started the center at Berkeley, and we're going to do basic research. We felt there's not enough basic research going on. There's a lot of clinical research applying it to various forms of mental illness, but no one knows how it works and why it cures. And I think that psychedelics have enormous potential to teach us things about perception and consciousness and how the mind works. And so there's a group of neuroscientists here at Berkeley who want to do that work, which is very exciting. And then we're going to do a public education program that I'll be more directly involved in, with a newsletter and a podcast and various, reliable sources of information about psychedelic science and business and policy, because there are all these policy issues coming up. So that's a big focus of mine right now, is helping to launch this center and raise money for it. And it's very exciting to work on and to watch the scientific process up close, because I'm not a scientist, but watching how neuroscientists come up with ideas for cool experiments and the challenges of doing them is all very exciting.
Fascinating. Thank you. Jules?
Wow. I've got actually a very quick last question, Michael, just about your background again. I know you wrote a book about building your own house. Is this it? Are we
no, it's not.
Flavor? No,
this is not. That is in Connecticut, where I used to live. I still own it, but this is modeled on it in terms of a long room lined with bookshelves. Although that building doesn't have windows on one side.
Okay.
But this reminds me of it. I still own that property and use that building whenever I can. In fact, I just re-roofed it. The roof gave out after 25 years.
Okay.
But yeah, I'm not in my little house, unfortunately.
Well, wherever you are, thank you very much for giving us 90 minutes of your time. I know you're very busy. You're making a documentary for Netflix as well about psychedelics. This is. It's a kind of a combination of it's going to be called How to Change Your Mind, but it actually has a mescaline episode based on this book. This is Your Mind on Plants, and yes, and we're shooting that now, and we hope to have it done by the end of the year. It's enormously interesting and challenging to do. We're trying to put the psychedelic experience on the screen and not use the usual 60s visual vocabulary that is just not even accurate. So we're working with some good special effects people and as well as my usual journalistic adventures. So yeah, that should be out next winter. Brilliant. Well, thank you very much. Just from everyone watching as well. And I hope we all the audience go out and buy This Is Your Mind on Plants. And Michael, great to see you. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Jules. Always a pleasure talking to you. And Martin, thank you very much. And to the Royal Institution audience, what a privilege to get a chance to speak to you.